There is often an unspoken expectation that the end of suffering announces itself with spectacle, a clear horizon, a decisive moment when darkness recedes and certainty returns. Yet the passage out of the long interior night rarely arrives that way. It emerges quietly, almost anonymously, altering the inner landscape before the conscious mind has time to register what has shifted. What once felt like endless trial begins to loosen its grip not through triumph, but through subtle reorientation. The search for signs becomes unnecessary because the one who searched has already changed. Jung understood the dark night not as a failure of the psyche, but as a necessary descent, a rite of passage that dismantles borrowed identities and exposes the structures built to survive rather than to live. In this descent, the familiar landmarks disappear, roles collapse, certainties dissolve. The ego, once fortified by approval and adaptation, loses its dominance. What remains is not emptiness as punishment, but emptiness as threshold. The psyche withdraws its energy from old attachments so something truer can begin to form. This is especially pronounced in the feminine psychological journey, where selfhood has often been shaped through mirroring, caretaking, and accommodation. The night strips away these reflexive postures. It removes the compulsive need to be legible, pleasing, or useful. What collapses is not the self, but the persona that learned to equate worth with acceptance in its absence. A quieter authority begins to surface, one not dependent on recognition. At first, the change is felt somatically rather than conceptually. The body carries the memory of prolonged vigilance. Breath has been shallow, muscles have remained braced. Over time, without instruction or effort, these patterns begin to soften. The nervous system senses that the emergency has passed even if the mind has not yet caught up. This is not relief born of resolution, but relief born of truth. The psyche no longer wages war against itself. Pain does not vanish. Scars remain sensitive. Memory still visits. But pain is no longer mistaken for identity. It no longer defines the inner narrative or claims ownership over the future. Jung described this as the integration of the shadow, the moment when what was exiled is allowed to exist without domination. Darkness is no longer perceived as enemy or flaw, but as terrain, something known, navigable, contained within a larger whole. This shift alters the quality of solitude. What once felt like abandonment transforms into sovereignty. Being alone ceases to mean being unchosen and becomes instead a space of inhabitation. There is no longer a waiting posture, no anticipation of rescue. The inner world becomes a place where presence replaces longing. Silence loses its threat. Stillness becomes habitable. Alongside this comes the erosion of urgency to be understood. The need to translate suffering into narratives others can validate begins to dissolve, not through withdrawal or bitterness, but through completion. The journey has been too intimate to require witnesses. The psyche recognizes when an experience has fulfilled its purpose. External affirmation loses its gravitational pull, meaning no longer depends on being mirrored. In Jungian terms, the compensatory structures of the ego begin to fall away. The stories once told to justify pain, to explain endurance, to render suffering intelligible, quietly lose their resonance. They are not argued against. They simply stop sounding true. The psyche no longer needs them to maintain coherence. What remains is simpler and more demanding. Presence without explanation. This marks the end of an internal conflict that consumed enormous psychic energy. The lifelong struggle between who one is and who one was conditioned to be does not resolve through victory, but through futility. The weapons are laid down not because defeat has occurred, but because the battle is seen for what it always was, a misunderstanding. Wholeness replaces perfection, integration replaces performance. Female empowerment, in this context, is not assertion against the world, but reclamation within the self. It is the end of fragmentation, the refusal to divide into versions for survival, the quiet refusal to disappear to preserve harmony. This is not rebellion. It is indifference to expectations that distort the core. The inner space becomes fully occupied, leaving no room for self-erasure. Jung spoke of emptiness as both neurotic and fertile. The night forces confrontation with both. What once felt like a void, threatening annihilation, begins to reveal itself as potential. Untouched ground, silence before creation, the compulsion to fill dissipates. Emptiness becomes spaciousness, the psyche rests. This is the threshold where the essay continues, not toward resolution, but toward recognition. The night has already been crossed, even if the mind has not yet named it. The evidence is internal, embodied, unmistakable. Transformation does not announce itself. It rearranges perception, and only afterward does understanding follow. As this internal reordering deepens, the relationship to meaning itself begins to change. There was once a relentless pressure to interpret every experience, to extract a lesson from each loss, to frame pain as purposeful in order to survive it. This compulsive search for significance was not wisdom, but a strategy to avoid the terror of randomness. The psyche clung to interpretation as a way to maintain control. After the night, that grip loosens. Life no longer needs to justify itself. Events are allowed to exist without explanation, without being conscripted into a narrative of growth. This is not nihilism. It is freedom from the tyranny of constant sense-making. With this freedom comes a new quality of inner quiet, not the silence of repression, but the silence of arrival. The mind is no longer crowded by constant self-monitoring or anticipatory defense. Thoughts still arise, but they do not demand obedience. The psyche has learned through ordeal that not every internal movement requires action. This is a profound shift in self-trust. The unconscious, once feared as chaotic or destructive, is now recognized as a source of guidance when allowed to speak without coercion. Emotional life follows this same pattern of softening without collapse. Feelings are no longer managed through control or avoidance. They move through the system with intensity and impermanence. Grief still visits, anger still flares, joy still surprises. But none of these states are mistaken for permanence. The psyche has learned what it means to survive feeling. Sensitivity returns without fragility. Depth is no longer paired with brittleness. Tears do not signal breakdown, they signal permeability. This capacity to feel without disintegration is one of the great gifts forged in the night. It marks the end of emotional catastrophizing. Rejection no longer annihilates the self. Disappointment no longer confirms unworthiness. The inner structure has strengthened not through armor, but through flexibility, like a tree that bends rather than breaks. The psyche has learned resilience through surrender rather than force. As emotional regulation stabilizes, intuition quietly reclaims its place. Jung described intuition as the function that perceives possibilities and patterns beyond linear reasoning. During the descent, this faculty is often obscured by fear and noise. Afterward, it returns not as revelation, but as alignment. Decisions begin to feel cleaner. Choices are made with less justification. There is an embodied sense of rightness that does not require explanation. This is not mystical insight. It is the psyche operating without internal sabotage. The body mirrors these shifts in subtle ways. Breath deepens, chronic tension releases, the jaw unclenches, the shoulders drop. These are not techniques applied from above, but organic responses to an inner ceasefire. Jung understood the body as an archive of psychic conflict. When the conflict resolves, the body follows. Healing becomes less about effort and more about permission. Patterns of psychosomatic distress often begin to lose their hold. Cycles of anxiety soften. Emotional crashes occur less frequently or with less intensity. This is not because life has become easier, but because the root of the suffering has been addressed. The psyche no longer uses the body to signal what the conscious mind refuses to hear. Alignment reduces the need for symptoms. This alignment also reshapes relational dynamics. The compulsion to rescue or be rescued fades. Relationships built on mutual deficiency lose their appeal. Jung would have recognized this as the dissolution of the savior complex, the unconscious attempt to avoid one's own individuation by merging with another's. After the night, there's a clear recognition that each person must walk their own descent. Compassion remains, but responsibility for another's healing does not. Boundaries emerge not as defenses, but as clarity. There is a withdrawal from spaces that distort the self, not in anger, but in discernment. Approval is no longer sought in environments that require self-erasure. This is not isolation, it is self-respect made visible. The psyche chooses coherence over belonging. With this comes the end of over-explanation. The need to correct misunderstandings or manage others' perceptions dissolves. Identity becomes internally anchored. Others may project, misinterpret, or misunderstand, and it no longer destabilizes the inner structure. Jung described this as ego-self-alignment, where the ego no longer seeks validation from the collective because it is oriented toward the deeper authority within. Social roles once adopted for survival begin to feel foreign. The agreeable one, the strong one, the reliable one, these archetypal masks, once necessary, now feel constrictive. They fall away not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. The psyche no longer needs them to ensure safety. What remains is something quieter and more demanding. Authenticity without performance. A particular form of indifference emerges here, often misunderstood. It is not apathy or withdrawal, but freedom from judgment. The opinions of others lose their power to shape self-perception. There is no longer an impulse to defend one's rhythm or priorities. Life is lived from within rather than explained outward. This inner sovereignty is one of the clearest indicators that the descent has completed its work. Jung distinguished between the ego as the center of consciousness and the self as the totality of the psyche. The dark night, in this sense, is the ego's pilgrimage toward the self. Completion is not marked by enlightenment, but by humility. The recognition that the psyche is larger than conscious will, richer than narrative identity, deeper than history. This realization does not inflate the ego. It quiets it. From this place, spirituality transforms. It loses its performative and doctrinal qualities. The sacred is no longer outsourced to institutions or authorities. It becomes intimate, embodied, woven into daily existence. Presence replaces belief. Experience replaces doctrine. This is faith without fear, reverence without submission. The essay continues from here, toward the final recognitions that emerge once the night has fully loosened its hold. The changes ahead are even quieter, almost invisible, yet they carry the deepest implications for how life is lived. A different quality of gratitude begins to surface at this stage, one that bears little resemblance to optimism or forced positivity. It is not directed toward outcomes, achievements, or blessings. It is directed inward, toward endurance itself. The psyche recognizes that it survived something that could not be bypassed, reasoned away, or healed prematurely. This recognition carries dignity. It is not celebratory. It is sober, grounded, and unshakable. Gratitude arises not for what was given, but for what was born. This shift profoundly alters the relationship to forgiveness. Earlier understandings often framed forgiveness as reconciliation, as restoration of trust, as moral obligation. After the night, forgiveness becomes internal and private. It is no longer a performance or a declaration. It occurs when resentment loses its authority over the present, when the past ceases to dictate emotional responses. Forgiveness is no longer about the other. It is about reclaiming psychic energy that was bound to old wounds. Liberation replaces absolution. Alongside this, the pursuit of transcendence changes form. The hunger for dramatic breakthroughs, peak experiences, or spiritual highs fades. The psyche no longer seeks to escape the ordinary in order to feel alive. What Jung referred to as the numinous is rediscovered within the mundane. A single breath, a moment of stillness, the texture of a quiet morning. Meaning no longer depends on intensity. Depth is found in continuity. The night also dissolves the fear of being forgotten, the compulsion to leave a mark, to be seen, to matter in the eyes of others gradually loses its urgency. This does not extinguish creativity or contribution, it purifies them. Action is no longer driven by the need for validation, but by alignment. Existence no longer requires a witness to be legitimate. The psyche rests in its own reality. This internal resting point alters how time is experienced. The future loses its emotional charge. It is no longer a container for salvation or catastrophe. Plans may still be made, intentions held, but worth is no longer postponed. The present moment becomes sufficient. Jung might have described this as the ego relinquishing its fantasy of control over destiny and submitting instead to participation in life as it unfolds. Silence takes on a new meaning here. Where it once provoked anxiety or restlessness, it now becomes a companion. There is no longer a need to fill every space with noise, activity, or distraction. Stillness is inhabited without panic. The psyche no longer flees from itself. This capacity to remain present without stimulation is one of the clearest signs of integration. It reflects an inner environment no longer hostile to awareness. Solitude becomes a choice rather than a consequence. Withdrawal is no longer driven by rejection or fear, but by discernment. The individual retreats not to disappear, but to listen. The self becomes sufficient company. This does not negate the desire for connection, it refines it. Relationship is no longer used to escape oneself, it becomes an extension of inner coherence rather than a remedy for its absence. The body continues to register these changes. Movement becomes more fluid. Rest becomes deeper. There is less urgency in the nervous system. Jung emphasized that psychic resolution manifests somatically. When the psyche no longer fractures itself, the body follows suit. Health is no longer pursued as an ideal, but emerges as a byproduct of internal harmony. Another subtle shift appears in the relationship to control. Earlier, life may have been managed through vigilance, planning, and emotional regulation. After the night, there's a growing tolerance for uncertainty, not as resignation, but as trust. The psyche has learned that it can survive not knowing. This reduces compulsive behaviors and softens rigid expectations. Flexibility replaces force. The need to explain oneself continues to dissolve. There is no longer an impulse to justify choices, rhythms, or priorities. This is not secrecy, it is self-possession. Others are permitted their interpretations without correction. Identity is no longer negotiated externally. Jung referred to this as the withdrawal of projections, the moment when psychic energy returns from the collective to the individual. A quiet confidence emerges here, distinct from self-assurance or ambition. It is the confidence of having endured oneself, of having faced internal contradictions without collapse. This confidence does not announce itself. It is visible only in how one moves through the world with less friction, less defense, less need. The dark night does not conclude with revelation. It concludes with ordinariness restored. One day, without drama. There is the realization that the suffering no longer governs perception. The past is remembered without being relived. The present is inhabited without resistance. The future is approached without demand. The essay now turns toward its final movement, where these internal shifts coalesce into a lasting orientation toward life. What remains is not a healed identity, but a whole one. The final confirmation of having crossed the night does not arrive through insight alone, but through a profound internal steadiness. There is no urge to announce completion, no desire for recognition, no need to display transformation as evidence. Healing ceases to be performative. It becomes lived. The psyche no longer seeks confirmation because it is no longer divided against itself. Knowing replaces seeking. And this knowing is quiet, intimate, and unarguable. What once demanded witnesses now requires none. Growth is no longer narrated for approval. Change is not explained or defended. It is embodied. Others may sense a difference or may not notice at all, and neither outcome carries weight. The transformation belongs to the one who endured it. Jung understood this as individuation reaching a mature phase, when the ego no longer looks outward for orientation, but rests in relationship with the self. This internal alignment reshapes how life is met. Challenges still arise, loss still occurs, uncertainty remains a constant companion, yet these experiences no longer destabilize the core. They move through a psyche that has learned its own depth. The night taught what comfort never could, that survival does not require certainty, and meaning does not require control. There is also a gentler relationship to effort, the compulsive drive to optimize, fix, or perfect dissolves. Action becomes responsive rather than reactive. Rest no longer feels earned. Stillness is allowed without guilt. The psyche has learned that worth is not contingent on productivity or endurance. This is a particularly radical shift in a world that equates value with output, and it is one of the most powerful forms of feminine empowerment. To exist without justification is a quiet revolution. The internal critic loses its authority here. It may still speak, but it is no longer believed without question. Jung described this voice as an internalized projection of the collective, a remnant of external judgment turned inward. After the night, this voice is recognized for what it is, a habit, not a truth. Compassion replaces condemnation. Understanding replaces punishment. With this compassion comes a new ethical orientation. Choices are no longer driven by fear of rejection or desire for approval. They are guided by alignment. What feels false is released. What feels coherent is chosen. Integrity becomes instinctive rather than aspirational. Life is lived from the inside out. There is also a deepening respect for the journeys of others. The impulse to intervene, correct, or rescue fades. Each person's dissent is recognized as necessary and non-transferable. Empathy remains, but it is no longer fused with responsibility. Boundaries become expressions of wisdom rather than withdrawal. The sacred, too, is redefined. It is no longer something distant or exalted. It is found in presence, in attention, in the quiet dignity of being alive without pretense. This spirituality does not require belief. It requires honesty. It is not oriented toward transcendence, but toward depth. Jung would have called this a lived symbol, where meaning is not conceptualized but experienced. Perhaps the most enduring outcome of the night is this. Life is no longer approached as a problem to be solved. It is met as a process to be participated in. There is room for mystery without anxiety, for imperfection without shame, for change without collapse. The psyche has learned its own elasticity. The dark night, then, is not an interruption of life. It is an initiation into it. It strips away illusions not to punish, but to reveal. What remains is not a perfected self, but a whole one. A self capable of holding complexity without fragmentation. A self no longer at war with its own nature. This wholeness does not protect against pain, but it changes the relationship to it. Suffering is no longer resisted or romanticized. It is encountered with clarity. Joy, too, is received without clinging. Both are allowed to pass through a psyche that no longer mistakes intensity for truth. In the end, the most reliable sign that the night has ended is the absence of urgency. No rush to arrive, no hunger to prove, no fear of being left behind. Life unfolds at its own pace, and there is trust in that unfolding. The path continues, not toward resolution, but toward deeper participation. If these reflections resonate, if something within recognizes this terrain, then this space is offered as companionship rather than instruction. You are invited to like, share, and subscribe if this exploration of the psyche speaks to your own journey. Leave a comment and share which insight touched you most, not as testimony, but as connection. Every shared reflection becomes a mirror for someone else, still finding their way through the dark.